In 1870, France seemed as divided as ever, as divided as they were in the old regime. There was the tension between Paris and the provinces, the commune and the provisional government, Republicans and monarchists, workers and bourgeoisie. The dividing lines and divisions were everywhere. So how could any one group make a case that they could unite the nation? Well, in this video, we're going to look at the creation of the Third Republic and what Republicans and the leaders of the Third Republic did to try to make a case for how the Republic, how another Republic, a Third Republic, would do the unifying work that the previous regimes were not able to do. And the main point of this video is that it was the kind of early Republicans of the Third Republic that found this sort of winning formula, a formula of what they called conservative republicanism, that was a political platform on which they could sort of pursue a nationalist mission, right? A mission of unifying the nation. Okay, let's get started. This video is going to be divided into two main parts. In the first part, we're going to look at the provisional government, the Paris Commune, and how the Third Republic got started. In the second part, we're going to look at how the Third Republic then pursued sort of the project of nationalism through the establishment and expansion of certain institutions and infrastructure. All right, let's start with the beginnings of the Third Republic. We pick up our story in 1871, the very beginning of 1871, when the Franco-Prussian War was sort of at its nadir, and this new provisional government, this new government of national defense, was created to sort of figure out what to do in the wake of Napoleon III's capture at the Battle of Sedan. The first action of the provisional government was to sue for peace. And after weeks of negotiation on January 28, 1871, the new government of national defense reached a peace agreement with the Germans. We talked about this peace agreement in the last video and how humiliating and destabilizing it was for many people in France. The government of national defense then turned its attention to establishing a provisional government that would have a bit more longevity and sort of set the stage for creating a permanent government to replace the Second Empire. So in February 1871, they called for elections to this provisional government. The campaigns for those running for office really revolved around one central issue, the issue of the war. Many of the delegates that were in alignment with the city of Paris and the people of Paris campaigned that they should have kept going with the war, right? Kept fighting against the Germans. And then there was another group of candidates who were deemed the party of peace, who advocated for the peace settlement and the necessity of coming to peace with the Germans. The results of the election were decidedly in the party of peace's favor. Most of France voted pretty conservatively. They didn't really want the people that were associated with Paris at that time. So the elections of the provisional government in February 1871 were yet another reminder of just how divided France was between Paris and the provinces. The person placed in charge of this new provisional government was Adolphe Thiers, named the chief executive in February 1871. He was a politician with a long track record. He got his start all the way back in the July monarchy. He was an Orleanist, but a kind of radical end of the Orleanists. He was often very critical of Francois Guizot, for example. Twice during the July monarchy, he was named prime minister, so he had already played a really central role in French political life all the way back in the 1830s and 40s. And he popped back up in the 1870s kind of as a moderate type. Open to the idea of a republic, he was nevertheless very critical of socialists and radical Republicans. And this is kind of evidenced by the way that he dealt with the Paris Commune. If you remember, Thiers was the one who called the communards essentially secessionists and said that they would be dealt with vigorously. So Thiers was this interesting choice of a leader, a kind of middle ground type who had lots of experience and who was starting to become more and more of an advocate of republicanism. In fact, in a speech on March 27th, he said, "The Republic is the form of government that divides us the least." In his time in charge as the chief executive of the provisional government, he managed not only to suppress the Commune, but also to pay off the indemnity owed to the Germans. And he began to shift the political discourse towards the idea of republicanism. He began to bring in more and more people to the idea of embracing a republic once again. That said, the provisional government was rife with political tensions from all sides. There was, of course, the split between sort of Paris and the rest of France. Thiers also had to deal with radical Republicans, people who were advocates of universal male suffrage, who wanted a unicameral legislature, kind of like the First French Republic, and who were generally sort of pro-war types. But then there was also the other side of the political spectrum, and this illustration here kind of shows the various figures involved in that side of the political debate. There was, for example, Henri de Bourbon, the Comte de Chambord. Chambord was the nephew of Charles X, right, the last Bourbon monarch, and he had lived basically the vast majority of his life in exile after the fall of the Bourbon monarchy. He was the legitimist claimant to the throne. What that means is that for those who thought that the Bourbon monarchs were the only true monarchs of France, he was the one that was next in line. And many in this moment, in the moment of sort of 1871, thought now is the time to bring the Bourbons back, to restore the rightful heirs to the throne. At the same time, there was still a kind of rump of Bonapartists around France. There's still people who supported the emperor, Louis Napoleon, sort of pictured here in the center. And other Bonapartists thought that Louis Napoleon probably didn't have a good claim to the throne, so instead it should be his son. Or others who thought it should be another Bonaparte, his cousin. These three are all pictured here. And then finally, there were Orleanists, people who still advocated for the kind of model of constitutional monarchy that was represented by the July monarchy. And there was still an Orleanist claimant to the throne, a guy named Philippe d'Orléans, who was the Comte de Paris. Then there was Thiers, the guy on the right here, who was leading the provisional government and trying to find a way to create a government that, in his words, divides the least. What's interesting is that it was in this moment that monarchists tried to make a move to restore the monarchy to France. The main issue was which monarchy? So in a series of meetings, monarchists got together to try to come up with a strategy. And the strategy that many prominent monarchists came up with was quite simple, actually. The Comte de Chambord had no kids, and so he had no direct line of succession. So the idea was, we name the Comte de Chambord, Henri, the King of France, and then when he dies, the monarchy passes over to the Orleans side of the family. This was a great plan, and it seemed to be almost ready to happen, until something went wrong. The Comte de Chambord returned to France in July 1871 and was immediately approached with this plan, but he had some conditions. He declared his intention to become the King of France. He wanted to be named the king, but he said that it would only happen on two conditions. First, the monarchy must be an absolute monarchy. He said that he would not adopt or promote any sort of constitution or charter. And in what became a terrible PR move, he said the second condition was that France must adopt the Bourbon flag again. He said that he would not be the king of a nation that flew the flag of the revolution. Chambord's intransigence basically led to the breakdown in negotiations. Unwilling to compromise, the sides couldn't agree, and progress towards restoring a monarchy stalled out. So what did conservatives and monarchists do when their initial plan to just restore the monarchy right away in 1871 kind of fell apart? Well, we have to remember here that their biggest fear was essentially the Paris Commune. It was socialism. It was radical republicanism. It was all the sort of ideals that those groups promoted. So conservatives thought if they couldn't implement a new monarchy, then they had to at least find a way to dominate the provisional government and put into power people who were conservative enough to preserve the kind of traditional institutions that they wanted to support, institutions like the church and the army, and resist kind of radical demands, socialist demands and radical Republican demands. Conservatives' next play came in May 1873, when the collection of conservatives in the Assembly for the Provisional Government took a no-confidence vote on the chief executive, Adolphe Thiers. It was a close vote, but 362 members of the Assembly said that they had no confidence in Thiers' leadership, to 348 that said that they did. With this signal of opposition, Thiers resigned the very next day on May 24th, 1873. And the provisional government went through a process of finding a new president, a new chief executive. Monarchists campaigned hard, and the person that ended up winning the presidency was a general in the army, General Patrice MacMahon. MacMahon was a general who had fought in the Franco-Prussian War and previous wars as well. He was a devout Catholic and very conservative. In fact, he was a monarchist himself. And he was the general that was put in charge of the army of Versailles that laid siege to Paris and sort of led the suppression of the Paris Commune. In accepting the presidency, MacMahon said, "With the aid of God, the devotion of the army, and the support of honest people, we are going to proceed to the re-establishment of the moral order." This term, the moral order, became kind of the code of his regime, his political regime in this provisional government. He and the conservatives aligned with him started to implement a whole series of reforms. One of the first things they did, for example, is tighten up censorship laws so that publications had to be checked by government officials. In June 1872, they also banned meetings of the Association for Women's Rights, a feminist organization, declaring it, quote, "a pretext for the assembly of numerous women who are too emancipated." And then in what became kind of the biggest signal of what the moral order really wanted, they provided government sponsorship for a building project, the building of a new church, the Basilica of Sacré-Cœur. Sacré-Cœur became a famous, or infamous, depending on who you ask, right, construction project. The effort was led by the Archbishop of Paris, and they decided to build the new basilica in Montmartre, at the top of the hill of Montmartre, in the exact spot where the cannons were located and fortified during the siege of Paris. If you remember, right, that was the kind of altercation when the army came in to remove the cannons from Montmartre, right, and the crowd met them, and there was a fighting, and they murdered a general, right. That happened at the exact spot that the Archbishop of Paris decided to put this church. They dedicated the church to the lives lost in the Franco-Prussian War. And the Archbishop of Paris said that the purpose of building the church was to provide an act of penitence for the French nation after, quote, "a century of moral decline, to expiate the crimes of the Commune." So this was the moral order. It was this kind of conservative regime that was in control of the provisional government for its first few years. They passed censorship laws, they banned kind of radical political associations, and they sponsored the church, right, in very kind of overt ways. So it really looked as though France was kind of poised to repeat, in some ways, the experience of the Second Republic. After a revolution that overthrew the previous regime, the provisional government sort of set up institutions for universal suffrage, and the populace elected people who were largely very conservative. People who were elected in this first wave of provisional government elections were people who were very skeptical of the Republican project in general. But what's interesting is that that pattern didn't continue. The next set of elections happened in 1873, was a sort of by-election year in which 114 seats in this new kind of provisional government assembly were up for grabs. And here things changed markedly because of the 114 seats up for grabs, 99 were won by Republican candidates. It turns out, as contemporaries wrote, that the first elections of the provisional government were really more about pro-peace than pro-monarchy. People were voting essentially against Paris rather than against the idea of a republic. So when given the chance to vote again in 1873, what happened, surprisingly, was that most people were in favor of a republic. This was a shot to the monarchist cause. Having failed in their first attempt to place a new monarch on the throne, they then sort of lost a little bit of the initiative and started to talk more about finding some sort of compromise with the Republicans in the government. That compromise took the form of the Constitution of 1875, the foundational document for what would become the Third Republic. In this document, you see examples of ways that conservatives and Republicans, monarchists and Republicans, found some common ground to create some sort of permanent political establishment. For example, the Constitution promoted a two-chamber parliament. The Chamber of Deputies was voted by universal malehood suffrage, something that radical Republicans really liked. And then there was a Senate that was chosen essentially by delegations from the municipalities all throughout France. The Constitution also established a presidency. Presidents were voted not directly, not through universal malehood suffrage, but by members of the parliament. Presidents were given the ability to pardon, to appoint military and civilian ministers, including the sort of prime minister of the legislature, of the parliament. And then finally, in a sort of final act of what we might call kind of conservative balance in this Republican constitution, the seat of the government was placed in Versailles, not Paris. So you can sort of see from the Constitution of 1875 that this is a document that is, yes, a republican constitution, a constitution that is creating a republic once again, but that republic is a very kind of limited and conservative republic. The Constitution was controversial. The vote that went before the provisional government members was decided by one vote, 353 in favor to 352 against. So to say that the Third Republic began in a sort of tenuous way would be a massive understatement. But what's interesting is that the progress of republicanism, the sort of steady acculturation of people to the idea of a republic, continued as the years went on. Evidence of this is the results of future elections. So the first elections for the first full government of the Third Republic, right, not the provisional government, were held in February 1876. Again, lots of people campaigned. There were monarchists, there were Republicans, there were socialists, there were Bonapartists, all kind of advocating for their own causes. What's perhaps really interesting about this is that most of the Republicans campaigned in a kind of conservative way. They campaigned mostly against the idea of Parisian socialism and radicalism. Leon Gambetta, who was a famous radical Republican, actually went out on the campaign trail and said that he and his party and the people allied with him were committed to the principles of the French Revolution, but not, quote, the social revolution. The Republican Party actually touted itself as the anti-Paris party. When asked on the campaign trail about whether he would support amnesty for the communards, right, the ones who were deported to penal colonies, Leon Gambetta actually refused. He said this in a speech: "We must take account of the state of France. We must look it squarely in the face. The Republic can gain intellectual assent, conciliate interests, make progress in the general conscience only by means of moderation among Republicans." Another Republican candidate on the campaign trail said this in a speech: "The Republic symbolizes peaceful progress, universal education, cheap government, and in a word, order, justice, and liberty." So you can see what's really fascinating in the elections of 1876 is that Republicans campaigned essentially on a platform of order, of stability, and trying to tie the idea of republicanism to these ideals. And the wild thing is it worked. Of the 533 seats that were up for grabs in the first legislature of the Third Republic, 350 were run by Republicans. This electoral map sort of illustrates how the election went. You can see it's divided into the various municipalities and districts of France. And in all the ones that are colored pink, red, and yellow, these are all groups of Republicans. The green districts were districts that were won essentially by Bonapartists. And the districts shaded in both light and dark blue were districts won by monarchists. So what do you see, right? Well, you see overwhelmingly pink, red, and yellow. Republicans won the day, and the Third Republic seemed to be the newly accepted kind of form of government for the nation of France. But the Third Republic wasn't out of the woods yet. There was one more incident that sort of tested the integrity of republicanism in this early stage of the Third Republic. The incident was what was called the May 16th crisis. And it was predicated essentially on tensions between the President MacMahon, and this newly Republican majority assembly. MacMahon, if you remember, was a monarchist, right? He was a dyed-in-the-wool conservative. And on May 16th, 1877, after months of sort of disagreements and conflict with the Republican Assembly, he demanded the resignation of the Prime Minister, a guy named Jules Simon, who was a Republican. At the behest of the President of the Republic, Simon resigned, and then MacMahon went on a kind of purge. He dismissed 77 of the 90 prefects throughout France. Prefects were essentially, you might think of as the governors of departments. He ousted over 1,000 mayors. He dissolved the Chamber of Deputies and called for new elections. The next day, the deputies, who had just been sort of dissolved, signed a manifesto denouncing all of these actions. Critics of MacMahon called his actions an attempted coup. MacMahon claimed that it was an attempt to sort of set the government right. And in October 1877, the elections for new deputies took place. MacMahon and his party actually created ministry-approved lists of delegates and sent them out to France. So MacMahon and his party said that in order to preserve order, right, stability, peace, people had to elect essentially monarchists and conservatives. What's funny is that Republicans essentially said the same thing, but in the opposite direction. They claimed that it was MacMahon's party that was the party of disorder. They said that he was the author of a coup, author of disruption and instability yet again. So both Gambetta and MacMahon were kind of saying the same thing. We are the party of peace and order, They are the party of disorder and anarchy. And the question became, who would French voters believe? Well, on October 28, 1877, the final day of voting ended. And it was, yet again, a clear victory for the Republicans. This map illustrates, once again, the kind of electoral results of the elections of 1877. In red are districts won by Republican candidates. In blue are districts won by, essentially, the slate pushed forward by McMahon and the Conservatives. 313 Republicans were voted back into the chamber, and only around 200 monarchists. So in its final test, it seemed as though the Republic was once again saved. The nation had decided that republicanism was the form of government that they thought, at least for the moment, would be the most stable. And the commitment to republicanism only got stronger in the following years when all of those figures who were sort of the quote-unquote pretenders to the throne, right? The Comte de Chambord, many of the Bonapartes, all died or faded away from the spotlight. In 1883, the Republican deputy Jules Ferry said, "The royalist threat no longer exists." And for the most part, he was right. This was the last stand for monarchism in France. From this point forward, France would be under the form of a republican government, really all the way up until today. The Third Republic became the government that divided the least. A compelling kind of argument for why people should embrace another republic instead of going back to one of the other political forms that had been in France over the past 100 years. In the next section, we're going to look at what these conservative Republicans did with their political authority. What kinds of changes did they make to sort of instill this idea, their idea of the nation, into French society? Education was the bedrock to the nationalist plan, or the idea of nationalism and how to implement it in the Third Republic. And the guy that was at the center of this educational push was Jules Ferry, pictured here. Ferry was the Minister of Education for a long time. He also eventually became the Prime Minister too. And he was tasked with creating laws that would essentially revitalize the public education sector and system. The laws became known as the Ferry Education Laws, and they happened over the course of a few years during the late 1870s and 1880s. One of the first ones was a law passed in 1879 about teacher training. The law created departmental training colleges to train secular teachers. It mandated that every single department in France had to have a training college for teachers. Before this law, there were only 11 in the entire country. This meant that there was a steady supply of secular teachers for public schools. Schools no longer had to rely on Catholic clergy to serve as the teachers. In 1881, one of the most important of the Ferry laws came into effect. It mandated that all secular primary schools, all public primary schools, would be free up to the age of 13. No more did people have to pay for primary education. And this law was supplemented by another law a year later that made primary education for kids up to the age of 13 compulsory. All kids in France had to go to school. Then finally, in really a way to prop up the public education system in contrast to the church-run schools, in 1886, there's a law that was passed that banned clergy from teaching in public schools. The idea here was that public education was to be done specifically by secularly trained teachers who were committed to the ideals of the Republic. They followed up this law with another law 3 years later that said that all teachers would be paid by the nation, by the national federal government, and not by municipalities. This is really important because there were some towns that were very skeptical of public schools and thus would sort of refuse to pay teachers. And that was one of the main ways that Republicans in the Third Republic sought to implement their ideals of French nationalism on the populace of France. The Third Republic also did some other things that might look a little bit cosmetic, but were nonetheless important to sort of signal their commitment to the universalist vision of the French nation. In 1881, they passed a law that abolished censorship permanently in France. Anyone could publish anything they wanted without having to run it by censors of the state. In 1884, they restored the right to divorce for the first time since 1816. They also brought back the Marseillaise. In 1879, the Republic declared that it was once again the national anthem of France. And in a similar move, the year after, they declared that Bastille Day, July 14th, would become the national holiday of the French Republic. These are both signs of their promotion of the French Revolution of 1789 and the ideals that came out of that revolution. They said it was central to who the French nation was. With all this said, the reality, though, is that this republic, the Third Republic, while committed to the ideals of universalism, celebrating the French Revolution and its legacy, nevertheless was in many ways a conservative republic. And the best way to show this is to look at the Third Republic's sort of relationship with feminism. So a little bit of context here. If you remember, feminists had been active in politics and in political debates for decades, for a very long time. I mean, some of the first women's political clubs popped up in the French Revolution in 1789 and 1790. And you'll remember when we talked about the July Monarchy opening up the press, this led to the creation of the first feminist newspapers like the Gazette des Femmes. But feminists fought a tough battle. Women's suffrage was not a thing that was supported by many people, and it was not a thing that they made much progress on over the course of the 19th century. And in the Third Republic, the situation got even a little bit harder, largely because of the Paris Commune. If you remember, the Third Republic very much defined itself in opposition to the Commune. Even Republicans were using the Commune as an example of what they were trying to prevent. And also, if you remember from our video about the Commune, many women were highly involved in the Commune. And the Commune did quite a bit to sort of honor the demands of many Parisian feminists. So in many ways, women and the Commune got kind of tied together in this period. And so those who were trying to sort of show that they were resisting the kinds of radical changes that the Commune embodied often looked at the demands of French feminists and rebuffed them. This led to certain changes in the movement of French feminism in the Third Republic. We can kind of see this in two ways, right? A sort of split between feminists who became what were called gradualists and feminists who became radical feminists. The main division between these two was essentially the question of what do we push for in the Third Republic? What kinds of changes are we pushing for, and how are we pushing for them? The best example of the gradualist approach was a woman named Marguerite Durand. She had her own feminist newspaper called La Fronde. And in this newspaper, she pushed for gradual reforms for women. In other words, gradualist feminists tried to break that connection between feminists and socialists that had long existed throughout the 19th century. She called this strategy la brèche, which meant like the chipping away or the holes, right? Little bits. So what did this look like? Well, in her newspaper, we can sort of see examples of what this gradualist approach was like. La Fronde published articles only written by women. All the journalists were women to sort of show that they were serious and educated. The newspaper published articles by female barristers, right? Female lawyers, doctors, to show the intelligence of many women that were serving throughout the country. It avoided hot button issues too. For example, it didn't talk a lot about women's suffrage. Instead, it pushed for gradual social reforms for women and claimed that this was a way to include women as equal members of the nation. On the other side of things, there was still a lot of radical feminists, or so-called radical feminists. Best example here is Hubertine Auclair. She too had her own newspaper, but unlike the gradualists, she was not pushing for sort of gradual, slow social reforms. Instead, radical feminists were focused on one of the main issues for women in France at the time, suffrage. Auclair claimed that suffrage was really the only issue that feminists had to really push for. She wrote in her newspaper, "Political rights are the keystone that will guarantee all the other rights." Auclair had no problems maintaining the connection between her feminism and socialist groups. For example, she actually spoke about women's suffrage at the Marseille Socialist Congress in 1879. And she protested in really provocative ways too. She refused famously to pay taxes because she claimed of her disenfranchisement. She held public demonstrations in 1900 where she publicly burned the civil code. And in her newspaper, she sponsored women to run for elections for deputies, even though they couldn't actually legally serve as deputies. Though divided, feminists did manage to get some victories during the course of the Third Republic. In 1880, for example, lycées were opened up for women. Lycées, if you remember, were these kind of elite high schools that were created all the way back in the First Empire. In 1884, as I mentioned before, divorce law was restored so that women could actually get divorces. And there were economic laws that were passed for women as well. In 1886, for example, women were, for the first time, allowed to own their own bank accounts. And in 1907, women who were employed had control of all of their earnings separate from their husband. So these might seem like small changes, but they're really important ones. Nevertheless, the main question of women's political agency was always sort of denied. Women did not win the right to suffrage during the whole course of the Third Republic. And this is mainly because of the approach of the people who were the leaders of the Third Republic, the founders of the Third Republic, and those who carried the torch from then on. It's summarized best in the words of Adolphe Thiers: "The Republic will be conservative or it will not be." The idea here was that conservative republicanism was the only type of republicanism that could unify France under a republican government, but conservative republicanism left women outside of the political community. Conservative republicanism, this was the kind of motto of many of the early political leaders of the Third Republic, and it kind of combined a few different ideas, right? This idea that republicanism would be a stable political form, but only if essentially the entirety of the nation bought in. And that means even parts of France that were quite skeptical of the Republican project. So the Third Republic in many ways was quite radical politically for its time, but culturally it still sort of gravitated towards a lot of traditional and kind of conservative elements. This is probably best seen in how it responded to feminist politicians, right? People who had been advocating in particular for women's suffrage. But what we'll see in the next few videos is that this story gets more and more complex as time goes on. And the Third Republic would change quite a bit throughout the decades that would come. And in fact, it's the longevity of the Third Republic that makes it so sort of unique for our study of French nationalism. In many ways, it was the project of the members of the Third Republic that became the most formative for the French nation. In part, not just because of the things that they chose to do and the issues they chose to focus on, but simply because of how long the Third Republic lasted. In a century in which we saw France cycle through political regimes one after another, some only lasting a few years, the Third Republic lasted for 70 years. That's a long time for its leaders to implement their vision of the French nation. So in the next few videos, what we're going to see is what this vision looked like and how political leaders in the Third Republic continued to sort of implement and bring into fruition this vision, their vision of the French nation. And we'll also see those who objected. But until then, until the next video, see you in class.